Welcome everyone to the Adelaide.net user group from wherever you're joining us, either in Adelaide or further afield, elsewhere in Australia or even overseas. My name's David Gardner. I help run the user group here in Adelaide, and excited to have Simon Kropp joining us a little later on this evening. Next month, so we generally meet on the second Wednesday of each month, and next month we've got Rob Farley speaking. So I was having a conversation with some colleagues recently, and just around the idea of, are GUIDs a great idea for a primary key on a clustered index in a database? And my impression was that probably they weren't, but that was a surprise to some people, and so I thought it might be worth getting Rob in just to go over some of those kind of fundamentals of good database indexing and performance. And so he's going to join us next month, and the intention is that we'll be back in person for that meeting as well. So hopefully meeting in the city in Adelaide, and we'll aim to try and make that a hybrid meeting, to make that available online as well, but that can always be a bit of a challenge. So what's news? There's a new version of VS Code that came out, the April 22 release, with some nice new features there. They've got file nesting as a new feature, so it'll sort of use patterns to figure out if a file could sort of be nested under another file in the File Explorer window. You can filter in the editor now. There's some improvements to bracket, pair, colorization. If you're editing Markdown documents, you can now drag and drop files into the document, and it'll automatically create a Markdown link. And apparently it even figures out if it's an image you're dropping, then it'll make it an image Markdown link. That's pretty cool. There's also a final references for Markdown. Some improvements for Java. I don't really care about that, but I'm sure some people do. And some improved documentation for extension authors. And also, if you're into the Rust language, they've added some documentation on using VS Code with Rust. Visual Studio updates. Now, there's been a few dramas around this today, and I know Simon's hit some of this as well. They're out, but they may not be gettable at the moment. So we'll go through some of the updates, but you may have to wait a little while before you actually get the bits on your machine. There seems to be some infrastructure issues with Microsoft at the moment. So 16.11.14 came out for Visual Studio 2019, which is just bug fixes, and they did update the internal Git version they're using to the latest version of Git there. For 2022, there's the new 70.2 release came out this week. So that's out of preview, and that's now the latest version. It's an LTS release, so that's going to be, particularly for enterprises, something to take note of, that's going to be supported for a longer period of time. Some of the new features there include a new global search, autosave, improved Git, and improved test tooling, faster code coverage, and something I believe it's coming in .NET 7 is a string syntax attribute, and so they've added support for that, which sounds like it sort of is a way of indicating that a particular string might actually be something like a regex string or a JSON string, and so that the editor is now going to be able to understand that. So we'll probably have to have a look at that in a bit more detail maybe later in the year. And so with 17.2 being generally available release, 17.3 is a new preview. So some new enhancements coming to the preview channel there. More test tool improvements, .NET productivity, some more refactorings, code fixes, improvements to the Razor editor, and the update all button. So I don't know, maybe this is the thing that's broken the Visual Studio upgrade. Everyone's trying to do update all, and maybe it doesn't work. I'm not sure. Hopefully that'll all get fixed pretty soon.
Yeah, it wasn't the update all. It was a CDN replication issue, something to do with Azure. So
yeah, it's always there's always a machine out there that can sort of catch you out if it's not working. And some .NET updates. So yeah, a whole bunch of updates today. So we've got a new version preview of .NET 7, .NET 6, the last update for .NET 5. So it is the end of the line for .NET 5. There won't be any more updates for that version. So if you've got any code running on .NET 5, it really is time to look at moving it to .NET 6. Or I guess you could go back to .NET 3.1. But yeah, that's sort of been, it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, but yeah, there you go. Now, quickly moving on, we did run a member survey a few weeks ago just to touch base with everybody and just make sure we're doing the right kind of things that are providing value to people. There was just a few questions there, a quick summary of the results. How did people want to meet? Well, most people like the idea of a hybrid, but apart from that, in-person was slightly more popular than virtual. So yeah, we'll be aiming to do hybrid next month. But yeah, certainly in-person event. We'll see how we go. There is more technical challenges being able to stream a live event compared to just doing completely virtual. So as you can see, we didn't have massive numbers of people complete the survey, but it was enough. So we got a good picture of what people are looking for. Some ideas for things that people wanted to hear about. So there was some really good suggestions there, and I'm going to be using that sort of looking forward, certainly for the rest of the year, just sort of trying to get ideas for speakers for the group. But also, if you're looking at this list and think, I know something about that, or that's something I'd like to learn more about myself, well, what better reason for doing that than putting a talk together and then catching up with me and saying, I've got a talk on the cloud or on Blazor or on Maui. Love to hear from you about that. These are the things that people have said they'd like to hear about more. We did a quick check on what's the best times for people to start, and it sounds like 5:30 is a good time for the in-person events. Some people liked it a bit later, but that was the majority. For a virtual event like we're doing tonight, again, 5:30 was the majority, but there was some interest in other times.
That's all, I think. And then I need to
Can people mute?
Or preferences.
Some exciting interruptions there. If we have a daytime virtual event, which we've had occasionally when we've had speakers from the US, then 12 noon was slightly more popular than 12:30. So, but I guess if we were going to compromise, we'd say 12:15, probably hit the mark. For catering for our in-person events, unfortunately no catering tonight unless you provided it yourself. People do seem to like pizza, but Subway is there a little bit. So maybe we'll mix it up. We'll go pizza most weeks, or most months, but occasionally have the Subway. Okay, moving on. Just a quick plug for the 30 days to learn. If you wanted to do one of the Microsoft Learn challenges, and then you get a discount off an exam, there's a link there or a QR code if you want to scan to get to the deal there. I've just got a few housekeeping notices and updates to go through. So first of all, we are on meetup.com, and usually that seems to work okay. Can be a bit of a challenge figuring out where the meeting link is. We're also on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook. We've got a YouTube channel as well. So I do appreciate you spreading the word about the group and just letting colleagues and friends know about us that might be interested in the content we provide. Don't forget the Heaps Good Dev Slack. So if you're a developer based in Adelaide or South Australia in particular, a great place to hang out and just chat about developer stuff, not just .NET. There's other languages there as well, other user groups, and yeah, just a great place to keep the conversation going. We do have a YouTube channel, and encourage you to subscribe. We'll edit the recording from tonight and put that up there probably in a few weeks' time. And we do thank Stephen for his work editing the videos. He does a really nice job. But yeah, Also, a quick plug for New Breakpoint. I think there's a new episode coming out possibly on Thursday. Sometimes they're Microsoft content, sometimes they're community content. Sometimes they get so desperate they invite me to go on. But yeah, a good one to keep an eye on Twitter. That's it from me. Thanks for listening. I'm going to hand over to Simon. I'm going to stop sharing, and we thank our sponsors, which are Encode Talent, and we really appreciate Simon and Christine. And I think Simon is on the call tonight. If you're looking for devs to augment your team, or conversely, if you're looking for a change yourself, then get in touch with Encode Talent. They're good people to work with. We also thank the people from Tap2, local Adelaide development company, and we have had them actually speak to us in previous months, and so we appreciate their support as well. Really excited to have Simon join us. One day, hopefully, we can get Simon in person, but
that would be awesome. Adelaide's fantastic, so I look forward to coming down there someday and meeting you up in person.
Yeah, so but in lieu of that, it's great to have him joining us virtually. So over to you, Simon.
Yep. So I'm in Canberra. Currently working for the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, so the big enterprise. And what we're going to be presenting on today is snapshot testing via Verify. So if anyone has any questions at any point in time, I'm happy to take sidetracks and dig down into any specific questions people have. You can either chuck something in the chat and David can triage those into a pause and ask me questions there, or you can raise your hand in the Teams feature and we can take a break and focus on you and you can ask your question in person. So make it as interactive as you want it to be, or you can just sit back and listen. In terms of the news, there was one other thing that was pretty cool that I thought deserves attention. I'll just share my whole screen. Thumbs up, Dave, for that looking okay? Yep. Okay, so the other thing in Visual Studio 2022 preview is the first release of raw string literals. So if you ever had JSON or XML with quotes and brackets, raw string literals are great for actually getting those into your code and still making them readable. And it works by this kind of magic convention of whatever starts the string also ends the string. So you can have as many quotes at the start and many quotes at the end. So you can have double quotes or single quotes in line and make that readable inside the string. The same works for interpolated strings. So you can have magic escape brackets. So this one's starting with 2 and ending with 2. Yeah, so that's worth playing with. If you're using Resharp or Writer, they don't currently have support to this. It's probably the next wave of EAP that they'll have support for this. And I'm not sure about VS Code. So that's that one. So I'm going to jump straight in and show you a test. Now, the assumed knowledge for this is you basically know what unit testing is and you know what assertion is. It's not very difficult concepts. So your traditional cert looks something like this. We have this fake class that is just returning some information. So this could be calling in a production app, it could be a web service, it could be a database call. This is just for demonstration purposes. So in here, we're finding a single person and then we're asserting all of the results of that. Now, this is often quite fragile. I'm sure people have had fun with this kind of stuff before where you change one thing or you test fail or you add a new property and it doesn't actually get asserted unless you go for an update all the tests. So I'm just going to quickly convert this to a snapshot test. Okay. And that's it. So now when we run this, a few things are going to happen. So firstly, we get a pop-up of a diff tool. So you can see that this is the serialized version of that representation. Down here, we also have a tray tool that has shown us that this is a system-wide tray tool that sits down here and monitors all failed tests from all solutions. And also over here, the test has failed. I'll just split these side by side. So you can see on disk, there's actually two files that now exist here. So you can see these two files exist here. So one is the received file that we've got here. The other one is the verified file, which is here, obviously empty. So this is the first time scenario where you've run this initially. Assuming that's the correct result, I'm going to accept that as the valid snapshot that I want. So there's a few ways I can do that. I can accept in resharper or writer down here. I can accept it down here. There's also keyboard shortcuts for all of these things. So for now, I'm just going to do my accept all hotkey and do Control-Alt-A. So Control-Alt-All. So now on disk, we have a single file. That is our snapshot for that record. So I've purposely added some things that are a little bit broken in this snapshot. You can see here that that's a GUID that will change between results. And this is a calculated field where if I go and have a look at person, right? So it's a variable that's going to change every single time we run. So if we go and rerun this test, I've hard-coded the GUID for now, so that's going to be stable. But you can see that the age has changed. So this is one of those things where if you're doing assertions, you would actually calculate the value and make sure it's greater than or less than or within a range or the exact value. But when you're actually doing snapshot testing, this is one of those things that can be a little bit fragile. So the easiest way to do that is to quickly modify the serialization settings. And sorry, I'll get that right. Just copy that one over. Okay, so this is saying that we want to, when we serialize this, we're going to ignore the member age on person. So now we run this again. And you can see that the age has been removed. So I'll accept that for now. The other thing is that GUIDs are often a bit fragile. So we can I don't remember where it is. Scrub inline GUIDs. Okay, so what happens when you serialize? The first time it comes across a GUID or a date time offset, it stores that in a cache, a test level cache. So the next time it finds that variable again, it's going to replace it with the same token. So this means when you are serializing larger models with multiple different IDs, those things are much easier to correlate, and they're also scrubbed in a way that are consistent between runs. So the first GUID is always going to be the first GUID, and it will be reused in subsequent serializations. So I'll just show you the, so this is the result of what those tests would look like. So this up here is global settings for those fat scrubbing and the ignore the age. Also, since you still want to assert that the age is correct, I've got an assert in here. So this is an important note because snapshot testing is not an absolute replacement for assertion. You can use both of them together. In fact, there's many edge cases that snapshot testing isn't great at. Most commonly, greater than or less than comparisons to ensure that date times are within a certain range or values within a certain range. Because those things are floating values, you need to scrub them from the snapshot, but then still use traditional asserts to assert those things. So I'll just show you the flow of how that worked. So this is the first time we ran it. We ran the test. The test failed, the diff popped up. We accepted that, moved the receive to the verified file and closed the diff. The second time we ran it, again, it failed the test. It compared the verified and received. It showed the diff and we accepted it and it closed the diff. So if I just quickly run through that again. So here's an example snapshot. I'll just modify it so that the test will break. I'll run it again. And this is the scenario you get. You get this UI pop-up that shows the differences between those two files. So we have the before and after. Any questions on that so far? I'm assuming no. Okay.
What's the benefit of using this as compared to actually write your own expected result and just go up and compare yourself?
So for starters, it's less code. So if I just get these side by side. So this is your assert.
Okay.
This is your snapshot test over here. So clearly there's less code, but also the initial assertion creates that first snapshot for you. So when you're approaching a code base, you have that functionality that you expect to work. The first time you run it, it will ask you to confirm that snapshot is correct, and then you can refine it further down. But it means that you don't need to write this code. You don't need to reason about it.
Yeah, what I'm saying is that what I did before is previous, similar what you do, but we write your own expected JSON or XML output, and then we just read the file and compare the difference between the things.
Yeah, that's the same concept as how this works.
But I guess this is more convenient because you don't need to read the file from your output.
No, and it also plugs into different tools as well.
Cool.
So in terms of what this does, it's important to note that this is just serialization, right? We are serializing a object, and in this case, we're writing it to JSON. But serialization in a general sense is taking anything in memory, any instance of anything, and writing that to disk. If that thing on disk is something that we can compare, then we can use that for snapshot testing. So if I quickly jump down here and show you so this is a WPF app.
Is that a request just to zoom in a bit? Some people are finding it a bit
Yep, hold on a second. So this is a WPF window here. I can put that side by side. Yep. So if we can serialize a representation of this to disk, then we can use that for snapshot testing. So if we come over here and so here's our Here's our test. We're just newing up a new instance of a window. And if I just delete the verified, I'll show you the experience of when you snapshot test against a Windows form control. So here, this time we got 2 windows pop up. We got over here is that's the current representation of the XAML state. So this is an in-memory representation of that form when it was running. We also have rendered that to a snapshot test, sorry, to a image. So you can see that this is something that's very difficult to do with traditional asserts, because asserting an image like this, you can look at the size, maybe poke into some of the pixels, but it's very difficult to write that. So with a snapshot test, it splits that form into 2 different snapshot files. So if I accept that and then show you what would happen if we changed something in that. So let's just delete a control and rerun this test. Oh, that's a shortcut for running all. Anyway, so now it's notified us that 2 things have changed. So in the running XAML, it showed us that we're missing a button, and it's also showed us that this is the before. This is the before. This is the received, and it's highlighted the difference between those 2 files. Now this works for anything you can serialize. So if you're producing PDFs, Word documents, Excel spreadsheets, all of those things can be serialized into 1 or more files, and you can compare those things to each other. The one I've found particularly useful at work is snapshot testing PDFs. So you do 2 things. You capture the text representation of the PDF into 1 snapshot file, and you capture all the pages as images into another snapshot file. And that means you can be fairly certain it's actually going to work without needing to do, start up the app and debug into it and have a look at it and eyeball it yourself. It also means it's a repeatable run. So you can run these tests multiple times and be confident that your app is actually working the way it's meant to. Any questions on that one? No? Okay.
Actually, one quick question.
Yep.
Have you had any luck with binary files of the like? So things like actual PNGs that can't be serialized to text, but say a image compression that generates a thumbnail from an image. Could that be done with verify? Does it have to be able to be brought back to text-based?
No, so any input can be passed into verify and it will result in 1 or more files. It doesn't necessarily need to be resulting in text. It can be. So if you were snapshot testing against say PNGs that you're producing, there's some extensions for image sharp, and the output of that you'll get will be the image sharp extension will read in that file. It'll generate the metadata for it, so the resolution, the size, any compression, all that kind of metadata, and it will also take a copy of that image and snapshot test that to a file as well. So you'll have two things of that. You'll have the metadata and the image on disk in a snapshot file. Okay, so I'm just going to show another one with this is to do with browser automation. So if I just start up this app. So here we have a very basic Blazor app. The fact that it's Blazor is kind of irrelevant. It's just what I picked at the time. It could be any website. So over here we have some tests. Wait a bit. So I've got a fixture over here, which is going to actually spin up our Blazor app in its own process. That's just to get it into a running state so I can actually talk to that website through HTTP. And then I'm going to run 2 tests over here. So one is going to query the actual page, and the other one will query the content. Okay, so for each of those tests, we got 2 files. One is the actual image, and the other one is the current HTML. The second image, so this one's focusing on a specific control within that web page. So if you just want to snapshot test how various controls look and ignore the navigation and whatever else, you can just focus in on those specific components. And again, that's the HTML of that specific control. So this can be very helpful when you're designing any web page, because you can slice and dice up what you want to snapshot test and store those in different components. Under the covers, this test is using Playwright, which is my preferred, but it also has support for Selenium, and there's a third one, I forget. So it supports the 3 main browser automation frameworks. Is anyone doing snapshot testing with Blazor at the moment? Yeah, we've got a good value out of this. We're doing a Blazor server side at PM&C, and we're combining BUnit with snapshot testing to capture those results and make sure they look okay.
Yeah, Simon, we're building out quite a big Blazor app at the moment, Blazor server app. So we'll hopefully be getting into doing some of that shortly. Okay.
Well, this is a mildly complex BUnit test. So here we have, that's the actual counter object of that Blazor app. And you can render that, perform any actions that you actually want to perform on that. So BUnit has this approach of you spin up a component and then you can perform operations on it. So you can click buttons or you can do a scroll. And then after that, you can match the state of that. So that's what a BUnit test looks like. The equivalent for that for verify is very similar, but we just, instead of doing the matches markup, you can pass that component directly to verify. And the result is, again, 2 files. This is a metadata file and also the rendered HTML.
Would you could that be would you come across in having a different result in different testing environment? That's different machine, what I say.
Yes, yep, you definitely can. The most common place I've seen that is for rendering of UIs where the UI is specific to resolution or operating system, et cetera, et cetera. So a common one you'll see is if you're doing WPF or WinForms validation, the rendering of those things can be slightly different per machine. So one of the ways that you can handle that is there's about 4 or 5 different image comparers that are lossy image comparers. So this one's using Image Magic, and this is a threshold that you pass into basically the tolerance to compare between those 2 images. So it means that minor pixel differences between renderings of different machines don't break your build, right? You can dial that tolerance up and down. The good thing about this is only for the image. As long as you have, in most scenarios, you can capture the image as well as some other state. So for when we were looking at a web page earlier, we could have the image of the rendered web page, but we could also have the HTML. So having a higher tolerance on the image is generally fine, because if it fails in a way that the content has actually changed, for HTML's changed, that will still fail.
Yep.
Cool.
Thanks.
Okay. So the next one I'm going to show you is parameterized tests. So one of the common scenarios we have is all test frameworks support in XUnit it's called a theory, but it's basically a parameterized test where you can pass in multiple values and the result of each of those values is different based on those inputs. So when you're doing snapshot testing, the default for a snapshot testing is the file is named by convention the same as the test. That doesn't work for snapshot testing because, sorry, that doesn't work for parameterized testing because you need to have different results based on the different combination of parameters. So verify automatically recognizes parameterized tests. This is a bit of a hack here because XUnit doesn't, extensions to XUnit can't access the value of the parameters that are passed in. This isn't required in NUnit or MS tests. But when you run this one, you'll get one snapshot per test that comes, per parameter combination that comes in. So you can see here that it actually has put the name of the, probably better if I open it over here. So this is param test underscore value equals value 1 dot received. So it's actually encoded those parameter values into the name of a file so that they're still unique against each combination of parameters being passed in. So this is a pretty simple example, but you could be doing any logic here, passing those combination of values to some other method that gets some value back, and you can have, again, you could still have multiple snapshots per test combination. So if you are parameterized testing a website, for each combination of those parameters, you would have HTML and an image for that combination. So it understands how to group those multiple things together. Cool. So you can see here, if I add a new value in here, okay, so I already had approved for value 1 and value 2. This is value 4. So we have the contents and we have the name matching that. So I'll pause a bit to explain the diff tool integration. So at the moment, you'll notice mine's popping up beyond compare. That's my preference for diff tool. It has a good combination of image comparisons support, text support, some pretty good smarts on comparing text. It's also blindingly fast and it uses very little memory. So you can pop up, if you want to, 20, 30 instances of it on a very basic machine. It's not going to grind your machine to a halt. But there are a number of other diff tools supported. So that's the full list at the moment. So they're ordered pretty much on preference. So when you run a test that does a snapshot, Verify will walk through this list of tools, try and find the best tool for the file format you have. So if one of these tools, for example, some of them only support text, they don't support images. But sometimes the combination will be, I found a diff tool that supports text and I found a different diff tool that supports images, and it'll pop up both of those. So it can have different combinations of diff tools popped up. And you can also control your preferences based on the order of diff tool that you want. So you can install any number of these, and in configuration, you can set the order that you want those to execute. And then when it gets a given file, so some diff tools support comparing PDFs. So when a test fails, you've got a received and a verified PDF. It will look through all your installed diff tools and try and find one that can compare PDFs. You can also write your own diff tools and plug them in. So you'll notice out of the box, it also supports Writer, Visual Studio Code, and Visual Studio. So if you don't have any of those other custom ones installed, I'm pretty sure it will find something on your machine to compare those files. Okay, I'm going to jump through and show an example of recording. What's a good one to show? Let's do HTTP recording. Okay, so this is a helpful concept when you want to assert some behavior multiple layers deep inside a program. So you might be calling some code that calls multiple different web services, and you want to assert that the correct request and response have been sent through based on that stack of executable code. But you might not necessarily want to reverse engineer that stack in such a way that you can plug into those different levels, capture those inputs and outputs, and assert for results. So recording is more of a general concept, and it's based on the technology that it targets. So the HTTP recording is using diagnostic listeners. There's also some entity framework recording that uses the entity framework APIs to record underlying calls, but it depends on the technology under the covers as to how that's implemented. So I'll just run this one. So you can see here, this is your method being tested. This could be multiple layers deep inside multiple different calls. It could be doing any number of calls to any different URLs. But notice inside our test, we don't actually need to get access to the results of those calls. If I just run this, okay, so what's popped up is, zoom in there. No, this is the HTML that's come back, or the response that has come back from the two calls. So we have one call here with a request and a response. The second call here with a request and a response. It's captured all of the incoming headers for both the request and response and the results. So in this case, it knows how to, it's detected in the response that it's a JSON payload, and it's correctly reverse engineered the JSON and put that in here. So notice there's no double escaping of the JSON here. And same for this one down here. So the same can be done for calls to SQL Server. So here we have a method that you're testing. And again, this could be doing any number of SQL statements. And when you actually run it, the result you get is all the different requests that are sent, all the different commands that have been sent to SQL. In this case, we've only got one. But it's also, in both those cases, it's also combined the value of the result with that recorded payload. So you can see here, this is our target of what we've passed in, and it's appended all the recorded results to that target. So if we were passing in something a bit more complex here, it's going to scrub this, but this will just give us a bit more complexity. So you can see here that the target that we've passed in, we've got the SQL result, which is 42. We've also got a date time that's been scrubbed. So this means that you can combine any kind of serialization of any arbitrarily complex model with the recording feature. So if I go back and have a look at the HTTP response, sorry, HTTP recording, you can see here that's the serialized target that we have, because inside here it was saying the result of this is the length of the 2 payloads. So when it was recorded, that was our target, and then we have the serialized requests and responses from the recording. So this is another helpful, there's another way that this is helpful. Often I've found that when I'm trying to debug something, I'll turn on all the recording features, sometimes only temporarily. So I'll turn on any framework recording, I'll turn on SQL recording, I'll turn on HTTP recording, and then I'll actually run my test. And you get this wall of information, but it means you don't need to refactor any of that code base to actually capture all of that information in a way that's readable. Then you can debug into it. You can have a look, oh, maybe the headers were incorrect of the HTTP calls. Maybe it was talking to the wrong SQL server. Try and work out what's wrong with that thing. And then you can turn the recording off and rerun the test, and it will collapse all that recording back away, and you don't need it in the resulting snapshot file.
That the SQL recording reminds me of a friend of mine, Ben Lan, who has spoken in the group before, who wrote some SQL parsing code so that he could write tests that would validate that the performance or the SQL that was being generated by an ORM hadn't changed. So yeah, it's sort of, I wonder if he could have thrown away that code now and potentially used this kind of approach instead.
Okay, well, let me quickly show you. This is Entity Framework. I'm sure most people on the call have used Entity Framework. This is building up a DB context. We're doing a query against companies with some arbitrary link statement. So this can be, any link statement you want. It won't actually execute against the server, so you don't need a test DB or a target. But when we run this, I'm actually passing in an instance of a iQueryable here. It actually gives us the SQL that's been generated. Zoom in on that a bit better. So here you can see that the equals of the value, the not equals of it's a pretty silly query, but the not equals of a good, and you can translate that to an actual SQL statement. So I've found this useful for trying to debug why a query is slow. Often when you're doing Entity Framework link statement, it's pretty easy to forget that you're doing returning a full row instead of just a specific column, or that you're doing nested queries. So this really helps you visualize what's actually happening with that query. And again, this can be used in combination with recording. So you don't need to have this at the top level. This code could be nested inside some other code that does a query, and you can run your unit test over a bunch of code and get a visualization of what all those things are doing under the covers. So it is quite amazing when you run this on a real code base. Someone has a test that's doing something in Entity Framework, and you say, so do you have any idea how many queries or what the queries are doing against SQL? And you have a guess, you might have some idea. You turn this on, you get this wall of SQL, and you go, oh, that's not good. Like, until you get that visualization, you don't know. Like, Entity Framework is so smart under the covers that it's pretty difficult to reason about what a given link statement will translate to in SQL.
Simon, with to configure that, is there anything required other than just adding in the using verified test.entity framework? Because I know in EF Core, to get it to output the generated SQL to your console or whatever as you're running, I think you've got to change some settings in the configuration of the DB context or something from memory last time I did it.
There's two models for this one. So Entity Framework has support for diagnostic listeners, and you don't need to do anything to get that working. You need to do one thing. This is a static initialization to basically say we want to plug into the Entity Framework pipeline, right? So you call that once at app startup or a module initializer, and ever after it will work.
Okay, cool.
If you are doing things with multiple different DB contexts, and you want to differentiate between which calls are going to which one, or if you're doing some complex multi-threading, this is not doing it at the top level is not great, and you want to, at that point, you need to plug into the individual instances of DB context and record against them specifically.
Yeah, okay, yeah, because we use being that we're using Blazor, we're using DB context factories and generating context. So we've got a lot of sort of mocked contexts which override live contexts and all kinds of weird and wonderful stuff. So I'd imagine we'd just be able to, yeah, well, in our instance, we'd just create specific tests just to test specific link queries, rather than trying to integrate it within other tests of other functionality. So
I found that you try and do both. So this is pretty standard approach with snapshot testing, especially when most people won't have done snapshot testing from the start. So they'll be plugging it into an existing system. So generally, you just turn on snapshot testing, you turn on the various features. So if you're doing Entity Framework stuff, just turn on recording for a test and then run it. It will show you the differences. And then you make a call on, is that information valuable to us? Is that information consistent? Do we need to apply scrubbers? And sometimes you'll wire it back, wind it all the way back and say, well, no, an assertion is just good enough for this. We don't need to use snapshot testing for those scenarios. But usually you'll find some value out of using snapshot testing for that. So in terms of just testing specific queries or using recording against your existing tests, you're probably going to find some value out of both.
Okay, yeah, because I know we've got, obviously very, very simple queries like this one here, it's what sort of one table and that sort of thing. We've also got really complex ones that have, multiple outer group joins and all kinds of weird and wonderful things joining across 15 different tables. And yeah, it's they're few and far between, I'll give you that. But, where they are absolutely necessary, it's good to actually be able to see what the generated SQL is and see if it's not a complete shit show. So
yeah, so the benefit of this approach is this is a fake DB context. Like this is just, I've passed in a fake connection just to placate SQL Server. So this one never actually executes that SQL. So it's requested that Entity Framework under the covers, please render what you would execute if you executed this queryable. So the benefits of that are it's blindingly fast and you don't need a running SQL Server instance to actually run the test. The disadvantages are that you need to be able to get access to this iQueryable, right? And often these queryable might be embedded way down in your stack in multiple different locations. So sometimes it's not convenient to refactor and surface out the instances of those queryable. So it depends really. If you do have fast path queries that you want to make sure they are correct, and this is the critical path for your app, it's probably worth refactoring them out so you can get an instance and snapshot test that specific instance. But for lots of other small queries, it's probably just better to use recording against a running SQL Server instance.
Yeah, okay, cool. I'll look into it.
Okay. What's next?
Another question, actually.
Yep, go for it.
Can you do any of this database snapshot testing, particularly with the SQL recorder, if you're not using Entity Framework, if you're just using raw SQL or things like Dapper, or is it only for Entity Framework?
Yeah, so this one is Entity Framework specific. There's a different package for Entity Framework versus Entity Framework Core that support the same APIs. The one I showed you earlier, which is raw SQL recording, that's just working on a SQL connection.
Okay.
So it doesn't need any framework at all. And you can combine those because obviously if you're using SQL under the covers of Entity Framework, you can combine those features. But yeah, you will see here that this is all SQL connection stuff. It's even called Verify SQL Server.
And so you just need to have any running SQL Server and you can record and drop a snapshot against database calls.
Yeah. So it depends on a couple of things there. Sometimes you'll need a running SQL connection if you need to execute it, but certain things you don't need, like with that queryable earlier. So you could, snapshot test the parameters inside a command to make sure that looks correct, right? So I'll show you another one here because you asked about SQL. So this is creating a SQL database. Doesn't really matter what it does, but if you're using Verify and you pass in a SQL connection into Verify, the default behavior of that is to give you a schema back. So this thing has taken this connection, poked into the database, and serialized the schema of that database to a snapshot file. So this is quite useful when, again, Entity Framework or any ORM, whether you're using some kind of script to create things or you have migrations or any kind of stuff where you want to change the schema of a database. This is very useful because at the individual level, those scripts can be reasoned about, but when you amalgamate them together and execute them when you want to do a migration, having a visualization of what actually the SQL schema is going to look like is very helpful.
Absolutely. So we use Dapper and sometimes, and general MS build publishing, but sometimes it'll leave tables in there if they're removed from the project. And so we get some of these remnants sometimes in some environments.
Yeah, there's a couple of edge cases in Entity Framework as well, where if you map things incorrectly, it'll call columns, customer_1 or customer ID _1 is the actual mapping. And it all still works because Entity Framework has mapped those things for you and, obfuscated that for you, but you don't know that you've stuffed up your mapping and that the resultant SQL database has this, mismatch between namings. And if you actually leak that into production, reversing that can be a bit of a pain.
Yep.
This is probably a good point to also highlight. These kinds of things are helpful over time as well. So especially snapshots of schemas. So SQL schemas, web service schemas, any of that kind of stuff where you have this kind of definition of what something should look like. It's really helpful over time because you then check that into source control and you now have a history of how your database or your schema or your web service has changed over time. So it means you can say, oh, well, this thing, we know this worked, 2 months ago, but now it doesn't work. You can do a diff between those two snapshots of those schemas. That's something that's very difficult to do if you haven't snapshot tested those schemas and put them into source control. Like trying to work out what changed between 1 month and another month by reverse engineering Entity Framework migrations is a nightmare. Ask me how I know.
That's really cool. I think it's something I've worked on systems that have used migration scripts and having a separate script for each change, but I've also worked on systems where they've just had one like a database project where you've basically got the canonical schema, and there was aspects to those two approaches I liked, but it seemed like you only have one or the other. It seems like this gives you the potential to have on the best of both worlds. You can still have your migration scripts, but you're actually seeing the the net result of all those and capturing that.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
also helpful if you've ever had to go through a CAB, a change approval board. And one of those things they often ask for, if you have like a database guys, like there's a database team who want to know what the change is going to do, you can actually say, okay, this is the schema before the change, this is the schema after the change. So that they can, very quickly identify what's going to be different there. They can very quickly look at different views and say, oh no, that's problematic, or this. It's much more difficult if you don't have that schema, because then you need to say, oh, in this, if you want to have a look at what it looks like now, we've migrated to the integration environment, and you can have a look at the database there and see what it looks like. Where this is a very easy thing that you can say, here's a before and after in text, and show them what's changed inside tooling.
Just had a question from Andy, just asking, we've been sort of seeing Rider being demonstrated tonight with Verify, but the experience of Visual Studio, is that much different, or is it pretty similar?
So it's almost exactly the same. The only difference is down here, where each of these tests has failed in the runner, there's an accept and a received. So this is a JetBrains feature. Effectively, Rider and Resharper both understand Verify under the covers and add these features here. So if it passes, the accept, received, and compare won't show up. So if you're using Resharper in Visual Studio, that feature will light up. Oh, sorry, it's a plugin. That feature can light up and you can use the plugin. If you're using the raw Visual Studio test runner instead of a Resharper test runner, then the differentiation tray handles it for you. So both this and this are performing the same functions. So this one's just right-clicked and isolated it down to a specific failed test. This one over here has been tracking all of our failing tests and what I've been approving and declining. So in terms of if you're on Windows, on Rider, then you want the plugin as well as differentiation tray. If you're on Visual Studio with Resharper, you want the plugin and the differentiation tray. If you're on Visual Studio without Resharper, a differentiation tray on its own will work. If you're on the Mac, I highly recommend using Rider. It's currently probably the best .NET IDE over there. So again, this will work. The extension will work on the Mac, but the Windows tray won't, because I haven't ported that to Mac yet. There is also a third option that supports all of those scenarios, and this is an approach that used to be used in, or still is used in approval tests, and that is when snapshots fail, it copies a command to accept that change into your clipboard. Now, the reason we moved away from that approach is it effectively overwrites what else is in your clipboard. So it's kind of it works, and you kind of have this kind of manual process of, if you want to accept a given change, you paste that command into a command window. But it was a bit clunky, and it wasn't very granular to be able to accept individual things or bulk or doing keyboard shortcuts. So that's still an opt-in approach that you can use for clipboard approach, but I wouldn't recommend it. So did I cover all the scenarios there? Oh, I guess VS Code you can use for differentiation tray as well.
Will the differentiation tray work if you're just running like .NET Test raw from console?
Yes.
Cool.
Yep. The differentiation tray, it's IDE agnostic. So any IDE you want, it uses, I think the implementation under the covers is named pipes. So when you run a test suite, once at startup of that test suite, it checks if there's a connection available there, a port on it. And if it is, it will route all of those test failures through to differentiation tray. Can people see the differential tray down here? It's a bit small. It's just a little red icon down the bottom right-hand corner.
Yeah.
So if I just discard all my changes and run this again. Okay, so you'll notice down here, it's currently red because I had a failed test before, but I'm running all my tests now. Oh, no, I've got some explicit ones. Let me clear that. Okay, so if I quickly do a red-green test with the initial one I had, where is it here? Okay, so I'll make it fail just by, breaking the snapshot. I'll rerun this. Okay, so, yep, it's failed. So down here, we have it red over here, and also in differential tray, we have it red. Now, if I just accept that change and rerun it, so even before I rerun it, differential tray detected that the file had been approved because it knows all the files that it's tracking. So when I accepted the change inside the test runner, it moved that received file over to the verified file. Differential tray noticed that that file had ceased to exist. It's gone back to being in a non-red state and stopped tracking that file. It can be a bit hard to grasp that until you use it. So again, this is probably a bit small, but inside the differential tray, you can control a bunch of features. The important ones that you probably want are to configure your accept hotkeys. So one will accept all the pending approvals, and the other one will accept all the open ones. Now, the reason there's an accept all and accept open is that when you run tests, there's a limit to how many diff tools will pop up. So I've got mine configured pretty high, it's at 20. That's because I'm using Beyond Compare, which is very efficient. If you're using something that's a bit more heavy on memory, you might want to tone it back down to, say, 5 comparisons. And then you kind of end up running your tests, looking at a bunch of different failed tests of the ones that have popped up and kind of approving them in batches, where the multiple is this number here. That doesn't happen too often where you have to approve in batches, and you can always override with there's always an accept all down here where if you have 100 failing tests, but you know they're all correct, you can batch accept all of those in one command. Cool, what's next? I think I'll just quickly get up the extension list. So while I've been doing this, I've shown a whole lot of extensions. You can see that's the list of extensions that I'm using for this sample. And those two as well. And I'm using the verified.x unit. So depending on your test framework, how you extract out, how those APIs extract out the parameters, the test name, all that kind of context is specific to that given test framework. So there's a verified.x unit, there's one for N unit, there's one for MS test, and there's one for Expecto, which is a F# testing library. So you pick the specific one that you want to use, and it will light up all those features. If I actually come and have a look at the different extensions, so the current list of extensions might be a bit hard to see. It scrolls a bit, but you get the idea. Extensions are really easy to write because Verify is designed to be extremely pluggable. So there's probably 5 or 6 main extension points where you can do recording, comparers, scrubbing, serialization. So some of these are only, 4 or 5 lines of code inside that extension, but it means you can pick and choose what extensions you want to plug in, how you want it serialized, how you want things compared, and to try and get that best combination for you so that the friction of having snapshots is decreased. So is there any, problems that you see with snapshot testing that you want to ask? I guess the main one which I've tried to highlight is between scrubbers and comparers and how you manipulate those snapshots. It reduces a lot of the friction to snapshot testing, and also the way that you can bulk approve changes to snapshot files. Is there any other things that people foresee as having problems with?
There's one thing I actually want to ask about, and that is running these as unit testing type things in pipelines where you have only a limited capability to write, say, if you're in a Azure hosted service for running in pipeline, you might not be able to write a received file. Have you tested this with pipelines much?
Yep. So I've actively used AppVeyor, GitHub Actions, and Azure DevOps. So the one thing you said about you don't have access to write files, that's generally not correct, because you are building something. You have access to the disk. The challenge is getting those things from the disk into an asset that you can actually see them. So depending on your build server, you want to plug in a little bit of YAML into each of these scenarios. And what this does is if a test fails, that received file exists on disks, but it's hard to get to without placing this in your YAML file. And these promote these things to assets. Right, so you can see in this case, on failure for AppVeyor, just take all the received files, recurse over it, and then publish those as artifacts to AppVeyor.
Okay, and that lets you actually see more details of the failure.
Yeah, well, it gives you the exact failure. So then you can actually take a copy of that file, download it, and have a look. You can do a local compare. So you take that received file, you place it on disk next to the verified file, and you do a comparison of them using whatever diff tool you want. Also, in terms of a diff tool popping up, Engine has, so this is the thing that actually pops up for diff tool. It has knowledge of these different CI systems. So when you actually run a test on a build server, it won't try and find a diff tool to pop up those comparisons, because there's no one there to look at it. And out of the box, it supports those. And there's also a magic environment variable that you can set, or you can just tell me what all of these are implemented as environment variables. So it's generally, is CI equals true or something like that. So if anyone wants to add extra CI engines here, that's trivial to do, and we can support those out of the box. Currently, I don't know anyone who is using the explicit environment variable, but I added it there so it didn't block that scenario.
That's pretty cool.
I should also say that this diff engine is, if you're using Shouldly or approval tests, under the covers, all three of those use diff engine for launching comparisons. So Shouldly has some very basic snapshot testing in it. It's more about passing some text in and it will snapshot test that text for you. It doesn't have the serialization capability or the scrubbing or anything else like that, but it does have some basic support there, and it uses diff engine under the covers to launch that comparison.
So I noticed with your examples with XUnit, you're adding the extra attribute to the class. We just had Andy in the chat was playing around with MS Test. I think he discovered that you don't need to do that for MS Test. But,
yes.
What's the function of that attribute?
So this is how you plug into So there's a before after test attribute. This is an XUnit feature, and it allows you to run an arbitrary method before and after the test is run. So this allows us to capture the current method that's been run. There is another way of doing this inside XUnit, but it requires you to effectively replace the test discovery. And that's too intrusive because you can only replace the test discovery with one thing. So if someone wants to use my snapshot testing library that replaces test discovery and also another library that replaces test discovery, those two things don't mesh together. So this is I'm not even sure it's very well documented, but this is a feature of XUnit to allow us to capture a bit more context as to the running test. And you're correct, this exists inside verify XUnit, and it's not required by NUnit or for MS Test or for Expecto. Is anyone doing F# testing and using Expecto? Nope. Okay.
Sure. I know. I remember when with approval tests, it had particular requirements around having to not inline things, and sometimes had to compile in debug mode because it
Yeah.
seemed
So
working.
You're correct there. Approval tests uses stack trace walking to work out what the current test is. And to be able to consistently walk a stack trace, you need to have enough information in the metadata of that stack trace to walk up and not inline things or, push async things down into different classes at compile time. So for approval tests, you needed to have debugging information turned on and also optimization turned off for your unit tests. So that had a couple side effects. It was kind of a gotcha the first time you tried to run it in release mode because it would break. It also meant that it slows it down a bit as well. Not much. This is unit test code, so it generally doesn't have that much execution. And it was also fragile because whenever the .NET team changed something about how that stack is written in terms of async or iasync enumerable, all of that kind of stuff, it often broke that stack trace walking. So with Verify, I've taken that knowledge and gone a different approach and have an explicit package for each test framework that plugs into the test framework API to work out that information. So it means I don't have any stack trace walking here to work out what the current method is.
It was nice coming from approval tests. It was nice to not have to worry about that anymore. So
yeah, every time I got a bug where someone said, "Oh, I updated to a new version of X of .NET," and suddenly everything has stopped working, and you're kind of like, "Oh," because the code for stack trace walking was horribly complex. So yes, this is a better way of doing it. Oh, I should also say there's also naming conventions. So currently you'll notice the verified files nest automatically under the test class. So you can see here, each test has them nested under. That's using an MS build feature. Some people prefer their snapshot files to be in a specific folder at either the project level or at the parent level. There's a convention where you can plug in globally and take full control over how and where those files are written to. So you can have all your snapshot files in one location if you want to. Personally, I prefer them co-located with the test, but again, it's a personal preference. I think I'm pretty, sorry, go for it.
I was saying I can see the file structure getting really big if you're storing all your snapshots alongside your tests and you have a large number of tests for a set of specific objects and you don't have an IDE that nests things like that.
So the IDE, well, that's, let me rephrase that. IDEs that don't nest, I'm not sure which ones. I'm not sure about VS Code, but in theory, VS Code should respect the MS Build syntax for nesting. I haven't tested that, but it is supported in Visual Studio and Rider. One of the problems I have with snapshot testing is there's a certain level of obscurity between when you're looking at a test versus the actual verified. So you're right, when you have a lot of snapshots under a given file, like if I had 50 tests inside this one test class and I had the associated verified files in here, it can be a bit difficult to quickly find the one for this test. So in this case, I can just go, oh, if there's only 2 there, I can quickly open them. But if there's 100 there, it's a bit more difficult. So what I'm hoping to do is add an extension for a couple of the more common IDEs. So you can hover over verify and it will show you in context those snapshot files, either rendering them in there or giving you the option to open them explicitly. So that's a future plan. So yeah, that's one of the drawbacks of snapshot testing that I haven't resolved yet.
As long as you can lump all the files into the one folder though, and just have them sit there out of sight, out of mind until diff compare fails.
Yes, well, that's generally what happens. Usually you don't care until it fails, and then it pops it up in your face to see what it is. The other good thing about snapshot testing is that if you have complex asserts, you might need to run this 3 or 4 times, fixing each of the asserts as you go down for one refactor. Where with a snapshot test, you get all of those in one visualization. You know that, X number of properties have changed. Do you accept or decline those changes? So under the covers of Verify, it's using Newtonsoft. So when it's serializing to JSON, it's just using Newtonsoft under the covers to do that serialization. So any converters or any serialization settings that you want to use through Newtonsoft, you can use through this. The reason it's not using system text JSON yet is that system text JSON currently isn't configurable enough to do a lot of the things that I want to do. It just doesn't have the control over the API yet. And that's because it was written as a primarily performance first. And a lot of those edge cases just aren't supported in that yet. I've tried a few times, it's just not there yet.
That's probably worth mentioning that the ability to configure verify is quite useful. I know sometimes when I've used it, I've had an object, but basically it has been JSON text. So rather than letting verify sort of serialize an object into JSON, I've already got the JSON here, so you can tell it to work with that instead. But also there might be parts of it you want to ignore, or it's nice to have that flexibility.
If you are passing in, you'll notice this is kind of a magic method. Has anyone imagined people have wondered what the heck that is? Because there's no class it's setting off, there's no instance, there's no base class up here. So this is, what's the term? It's basically included the static type into all the test classes. So it's a new C# feature. If you're using an older version, this is the equivalent of, Rider's too smart for me. So it's the equivalent of that. But Rider's automatically said qualifier is redundant because it's been automatically included by the NuGet package. But this static verify class has several other things in here. So you can pass in a file, which gives you overloads for types and streams. Also, JSON is such a common scenario that you can pass in an arbitrary text blob of JSON or a stream of JSON. It also has explicit tuple support as well. Also,
the is there any extra special built-in support for things like exceptions for expected exception cases? Or just matching normal is fine?
Yep. So we have sorry, I'll bring up my verifier again so I have all the different. You have throws, which is accepts a function or an action, and that works the same as assert.throws. So assert.throws gives you back a instance of the exception. Verify throws will actually serialize the instance of that exception to a snapshot file. There's an overload with a throws task, and the reason for that is the nuance around async tasks and how they throw. So if you want to verify that a method throws and that method is async, you've got to use throws task. If it's not if it's synchronous, not async, then you can just use throws.
Cool.
Right, so I could do passing in. Is that async? No, it's not. Right, so that would be the equivalent to assert that throws. Obviously, this will fail because that doesn't throw, but
yep.
You know, you get the idea.
Yeah, and I'm assuming that the serialization will ignore anything like timestamps and. Yeah,
so it puts the instance of the exception through the same scrubbing pipeline as everything else. So date times, GUIDs, all that stuff gets scrubbed and replaced with tokenized. You can, ignore specific members, etc., etc. I should also say all of those scrubbings, I've applied what I think are sensible defaults. You can turn any of them off. So if you don't want to scrub date times or you don't want to scrub GUIDs, you can turn that off, and you can turn it off at any level. So the settings in Verify are 3 levels. There's globally static, so that affects all tests. You can create an instance of a settings class, which is what this one's doing here, and use this instance for a subset of tests. You just pass in that instance. So here, right? So you can share settings amongst any arbitrary number of tests. And there's also at the level of per method. So if I wanted to do this at the method level, I can just chain this off here. Right, and now that's redundant up there.
And you could actually then do that to say you want to normally ignore date times, but you have a person that has a date of birth and that it's a date time to unignore that for a serialization test. Yeah, so you could say, don't scrub GUIDs globally, except in these cases. Yeah. Nice. This is some interesting. I'm going way over time. How long are we meant to be going for?
I think we're about sort of wrapping up time about now. So
okay, I'll show you one more little thing. So under the covers, Verify returns. It doesn't return a task. It returns a settings task, which is something that you shouldn't even need to worry about. But the cool thing about that is this under the covers, it takes in all this information, modifies the serialization, changes any of the settings, and it's not until the actual point in time where that settings task gets cast to a normal task that all that stuff applies. So it means that because it's async, I can leverage a side effect of implicit conversion in C# to do a fluent API directly off a task. Does that make sense?
That's pretty clever.
Because if it looks at when you incorporate this with Fluent API.
Sorry, can you ask that question again?
What does the code looks at when you have this along with Fluent API together?
Well, this is a Fluent API, so you can chain any number of things together in here. So I can, ignore the stack trace if it was an exception. I can,
yeah, I mean Fluent assertion, not assertion framework, right?
Okay, so in terms of if you have existing assertion frameworks, I often find a combination of using traditional asserts together with verify works best. In this case, you could have, if I just revert off way back. So that could, this is a XUnit assert. So this could be a fluent assertion down here. You can either have the asserts before or after the snapshot test. That's your call. The first one that fails, you're not going to know about the second one. So if I put this up here, and if this fails, the snapshot test isn't going to pop up because all the assertion libraries work on the assumption that when something fails, it throws an exception. There's a few Fluent APIs where you can do multiple assertions, but they're not very common. But you could use Fluent assertions in here or anything else as well. There's also support for mocking libraries. So if you want to do, say you mock something up and then in your asserts you say, I want to assert that against this mock, these methods were executed, you can just pass in the instance of that mock directly into verify and it will serialize those calls that were made to that mock. So in this case, we're mocking up a new target. So here's our interface. We're doing a setup against that. We're executing something against that mock, and then we're verifying the mock. And then that will serialize all the calls against it. So if it wasn't for this, I'd have to say that, assert that mock received 1 call 2 method with arguments equal 1 and 2, and the response was this. Because if you look at, have a look at how mock looks like. So that's for syntax. So that there, where it's saying, verify that this library received a download exist with that call at most once. So if you're using verify for snapshot testing, you just pass that mock directly into verify, and it will serialize that to a snapshot. And that snapshot looks like this. It also means that you capture side effects easier, because this asserts one thing, but if you had different calls to different things that you didn't expect, you would also have to assert all of those as well. Where if you're doing snapshot testing, you get all of the calls that were made against that mock. Cool.
Great stuff. We're probably getting up to time. I realized at the start I forgot to ask some questions. So I'm just going to quickly, before we wrap up, and hit this button, and if it works, we should have some little questions there. So I'll give you a few seconds to fill that out. You can hit more than one on that one. And
I should also say while that's going on, all of this is MIT. It's all open source. Some of the libraries that I'm extending are commercial. So Expose, I've got explicit support for Expose because my current employer uses Expose for rendering documents. So my extension to Expose is under MIT 3, but if you want to use Expose, you need a license. That's true for a few of those, but most of the stack for each of different plugins is free under MIT.
Yeah, it's interesting, the spread of test framework usage. Okay, next one. You can see I had fun creating these last night. So this one I should have asked at the start. I threw just in there because it does have a snapshot feature. I don't think it's as advanced as Verify.
Yeah, there is a few other snapshot testing libraries that I've seen that have taken a kind of a command line approach where you're running your test interactively. So you run your tests, the first one that fails, it tells you it's failed. You type something in the console to open that or close or accept it or decline. Personally, I didn't like that approach, which is why I went with, of the whole popping up of diffs and multiple execution. I think it maps better to how tests are executed inside IDEs in .NET.
Okay, and I did have one on .NET Framework usage, but I don't think we'll worry about that one. But final one. Very cool.
So if anyone has any more questions, feel free to reach out. I'm Simon Crop on Twitter. You can raise issues on the GitHub repos. If anyone wants to extend Verify to support different libraries or toolkits, let me know. Yeah, I'd like to have explicit support for Postgres, but because I'm not actively using Postgres, it's just not hit the top of my queue. But yeah, there's a lot of different scenarios where value could be added for specific technologies. So yeah, let us know.
And yeah, just to echo Simon's earlier comment that it's actually pretty easy to build one of those add-ins because even I managed to do it. So yeah, especially if you're basing it off of something that sort of already exists and just need to adapt it a bit. So yeah, it's quite a powerful ecosystem. Well, with that, thank you, Simon, for giving up your evening to spend with us. And I've got a lot of it, and I've used Verify, but I've got some ideas now how I can use it better and some things I need to dig into. I hope other people found it useful as well, and look forward to catching you all again next month. But thank you, Simon, and good evening, everyone.
Before you go, Dave.
Yep.
Martin here. Can I just ask an admin question? I had a difficult time getting in, and I started off on my iPad. It said I had to install the Meetup application rather than browse, so I did that.